Hi, so I'm Brooke, and I'm going to be talking about the creation of Hare's psychopathy checklist. So I'm going to start out with giving a little bit of a timeline about the term of psychopathy. So first, Felipe Pinel was one of the first to describe the population of psychopathy. It was still a very broad term at that time, and there were no tests done, and they still didn't really know much exactly about the history of it. They just knew that it dealt with insanity and rational madness. And then that is when J.L.A. Koch in 1888 first used the term psychopathy. It was still very broad, and this was when they were trying to figure out the difference between sociopaths and psychopaths. And then later on in 1941, Herman Klecki published his book Psychopathic States, which was when they first started to get an actual glance at the term psychopath as a whole. But his book lacked diagnostic clinical traits, and then that's when Robert Hare came into the picture, when he decided that there needed to be a test that would clinically prove traits and be able to really decide if someone is a psychopath or not just by the looking at factors in the environment. So he developed a checklist to make a clinical definition and approach on psychopaths. So Robert Hare created this checklist, also known as the PCL, in 1970s. He is a forensic psychologist who is known for his work and research in criminal psychology. Hare's work with male offenders and inmates in Vancouver in a jail was one of his main reasons for creating the checklist, because he wanted to be able to decide if these criminals were psychopaths. He was inspired by Klecki's book to really identify if someone was a psychopath or not. So this checklist is a psychological assessment tool that is used to design the presence of psychopathy in individuals. It's the standard screening test still used today to clinically detect a psychopath and assess their violence. It was created in order to stop criminals from reoffending violent crimes. That was his main goal as he worked in the jail. And it was more for finding potential risks of a convicted subject to relapse and be able to decide if a subject, it can help them with their parole and be able to decide their mindset and if they actually are a psychopath or not. He created the test for the intent of using it on the adult males, criminal psychiatric hospitals, and those awaiting psychiatric evaluations or trials. And he was looking for a more reliable test because there really were no tests done to assess whether or not someone was a psychopath or not, other than tests that I'll mention later that was described in Klecki's book, but it wasn't as reliable as it should have been, which sparked Hare's inspiration. And he just wanted to create a better environment instead of just using environmental factors as to whether or not someone is a psychopath or not. So for psychopathy, before Hare came along, there was clinical judgment, self-report, and behavioral measures that were used, but there really was no test done or a consistent way of confirming that someone is a psychopath or not. It was just based on the own criminal's mindset. There wasn't a set list of whether or not you are a psychopath or not. So in Klecki's book that I mentioned earlier, there was a scale called the 0 to 7 scale that was used to rate offenders, whether or not they had psychopathic tendencies, and it had good reliability, but their score was only a single measure, and so it wasn't very consistent, and there wasn't enough evidence to support whether or not they were a psychopath. So once the PCL came along, the main reason for his test was to identify the features and all of the traits and behaviors that went into making global ratings and making a more objective measure that could assess the presence of those features of a psychopath. It was a solution that could provide common measurement accessible to being able to report a psychopath. So how this test works is it is a 22-question test, and it asks questions on your environment of whether or not you're a psychopath, which I will show the test in just a second. And it is a 3-rank test, and the clinical provider will decide whether or not the item applies, it doesn't apply, or if if it somewhat applies. 22 questions are asked, and an evaluator compares the individual's profile with a protocol for a psychopath. And then the scores are summed to create a rank of 0 to 40. And some notable evaluations that have been done were Ted Bundy was a 39 out of 40, and what Harry decided was that a 30 out of 40 you are considered a psychopath, but obviously this test wasn't the only thing done to decide whether or not you're a psychopath. It was just another example as to why to show. So even though Jeffrey and John didn't score above 30, there were still other factors as to why they could have been. So this is the actual test, and I won't read all of them, but so you rank it as to whether or not it fits them, it might fit them, or it doesn't fit them. And then, so some of them are impulsivity, frequent marital relationships, juvenile delinquency, promiscuous sexual relations, and then these are all just factors whether or not you show tendencies of a psychopath, and then it's added up and summed up to 40. So for the results of this test, reliability and validity of the checklist were significantly correlated with factors of a psychopath, including antisocial disorder, having no empathy, substance use, self-related criminal activity, and observer ratings of interpersonal behaviors. And the results of the PCL have ended up being used in forensic settings today as a factor that decides the length and type of prison time, and also different treatments that the subject took. And also today it really helps decide that if a criminal should be let out on parole or if they deserve jail time, because it's a good factor as to whether or not they fit the criteria. So today with the PCL, there is a new composed version of it, and it's only 20 questions instead of 22, because after results they decided that 2 of the questions were not very valid and they weren't useful in the test. And also in a clinical setting, people began to see it as a simple and valid tool to evaluate possible violent tendencies as well as sexual aggressiveness in men, women, and adolescents.
When he was creating the test, you said that he used it on a lot of male prisoners. Was it ever tested on females?
Yeah. So when he decided that he wanted to make the checklist, he worked in only a male prison. So most of the research that I found is just on males, but as you go more into today's time, it is used on males and females, and it was shown that it's just as effective on males and females. It's not based on just one gender. It works on both.
So, in your own personal educated opinion, how valid is this test if Dahmer and Gacy do not come out as psychopaths?
Yeah, so that's where I'm kind of half and half on it, because obviously it showed that Ted Bundy was, but you have to, Hare made a good point that his test should not be the only thing that's used. It's just reliable enough to be able to explain why they most likely are, but he said that you need to include environmental factors and other statistical things, and you need to be able to know their background and not just that test alone to be able to show that someone's a psychopath.
What is the average person score then, your day-to-day?
So an average person, I read that they get a 0 to 5. They still have some tendencies, and then 30 to 40 is you are considered a psychopath, and then in the middle it's kind of just you have to include the other factors. So